The seminars are a part of the 20 Years of War project, a 2-year collaboration between the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, which is the home of the Cost of War project, and the Pardee Center, which is the home of the 20 Years of War project of the Cost of War project. So the 20 Years of War project is looking at various consequences of the post-9/11 wars and taking a longer term perspective. The next seminar will be November 18th, and that will cover the Panama economy. But today we're very fortunate to be joined by Jessica Katzenstein, who is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Brown University. Her paper for the Cost of War project is called "The Wars Are Here: How the United States Post-9/11 Wars Helped Militarize US Police." She'll speak for about 25 minutes. Thank you. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Nita. And thank you to Boston University and to Heidi for the invitation to speak to you today, to John for coordinating this, and of course to Nita for moderating. I also want to give a quick thanks to Yueshan Lee, Aubrey, Cost of War intern, who ran most of the calculations and created all the graphs in my report. I'm really happy to be here remotely. So to start, I want to note that in this moment of potential transformation, it's key to analyze both the deep roots and the recent upsurge of police militarization in order to grasp what calls for demilitarizing the police could mean. When we look at the policing of the George Floyd protests this summer, when we see the Department of Homeland Security flying surveillance aircraft over protests in 15 cities, when we see police using tear gas, which is a weapon banned in warfare, against unarmed protesters, it's important to understand what is exceptional and new about this moment and what is not. It's also key to understand the ways that militarization far exceeds military style equipment that we see on the streets and exceeds simplistic binaries of civilian or military and foreign or domestic. So in this talk, I'll start by sketching some of the historical roots of police militarization in the US. Then I'll explain 3 ways that policing has gotten more militarized since 9/11. And I'll close by tracing some of the costs of this militarization, not only in dollar terms, but also in the currencies of racialized violence, lost opportunities, and critical global analysis. In reckoning with these costs, we have to understand that militarization is not a dial that can be turned down by more tightly regulating equipment transfer programs, nor is it an issue that can be addressed in isolation from more foundational questions of what US policing is and has been. So to start, military equipment is what's most visible to most of us, whether it's used by paramilitary SWAT teams or by protest police. However, scholars of militarization consider the term to encompass a much larger array of factors. For instance, departments' use of military language and counterinsurgency tactics, the spread of police paramilitary units, and military-derived ideologies about what uses of violence are considered legitimate and moral. So again, while some of the militarization we see today is new, for instance, mine-resistant vehicles built for the streets of Iraq, broadening our definition of what constitutes militarization helps us understand that it emerged from much older and intertwined histories of anti-Black and colonial state violence, which remain the bedrock of militarization today. So for one, the roots of militarization are laced throughout America's 400-year history of Black oppression. As Tamara K. Nopper and Mariam Kaba have argued, quote, "The war on terror has not come home, it has always been here." So just to give a very brief sense of this, slave patrols in the South overlapped in roles with the federal military and colonial militias, all labored to repress uprisings and terrorize enslaved people, and later Black people living under Jim Crow. Police departments in the South developed seamlessly from slave patrols and militias, formalizing these more informal roles of attempting to control Black communities. In the 1960s, while the US military was fighting in Vietnam, police drew on military expertise to develop counterinsurgency tactics against Black liberation and anti-war movements. Famously, the Los Angeles police inspector, Daryl Gates, championed the nation's very first SWAT team after consulting with local Marines in a nearby base on counterinsurgency tactics, because Gates saw the 1965 Watts uprising in LA as, quote, guerrilla warfare, akin to Vietnamese insurgency and requiring military training and equipment to suppress. The idea of a specialized paramilitary unit, which we sort of take for granted today, took a while to catch on back then, but a combination of the 1968 protests, labor unrest, and the civil rights movement in general produced in many police departments a desire for more specialized and quasi-militaristic units to control and repress protests. And then in the war on drugs under Nixon and especially Reagan, we saw the authorization of police use of military tactics like no-knock raids, which allow police to break into a home unannounced. And these tactics have been disproportionately used against Black civilians, as I'll discuss later. In 1985, US police even dropped a satchel bomb on the compound of MOVE, a Black liberation group in Philadelphia, after shooting over 10,000 rounds of ammunition into the compound. The bomb and the subsequent blaze killed 5 children and 6 adults, destroyed multiple city blocks, destroying the homes of over 250 people. So militarized policing has always demarcated who is subject to SWAT raids and satchel bombs and who is not. Similarly, police militarization is historically inseparable from American colonial and imperialist projects abroad. And again, just to give a brief sense of that, northern cities' first formal police departments were patterned on the British model of policing, which drew its organization and hierarchy from the military. The architect of the British model was Sir Robert Peel, who developed these famous principles of policing, which are still widely cited today in US police departments. And these principles developed the idea of policing as sort of an alternative to military repression, though it was bureaucratized in very similar ways. Policing was meant to be founded on public legitimacy rather than just the pure brute exercise of force. And that legitimacy itself would be founded on impartially serving the law without regard to the law's justice or injustice, and minimizing the use of force because it undermines trust. And it's used now in US policing when people are sort of trying to promote a return to quote unquote community policing. What's often left out of this story is that Peel developed these principles while overseeing Britain's occupation of Ireland. He found that peace preservation police forces could quell rebellious crowds and undermine anti-colonial resistance more effectively than could occupying troops who provoked backlash and resistance. The continuing centrality of Peel's principles today demonstrates how colonial management is built into the DNA of US policing. To take another example, look at the prominent American police reformer, August Vollmer. He was the first police chief of Berkeley in 1909. He's often called the father of modern policing in the US. He created the first police training schools and standardized tests, and he's even now often called highly progressive for hiring Black officers and women, developing police bike patrols, and helping to establish police higher education. What's important to note is that Vollmer based these innovative reforms explicitly and self-consciously on military models. He had served in the Philippine-American War and imported military tactics into modern US policing. He developed new record-keeping systems that tracked and predicted criminal activity, just as the US military attempted to identify insurgent activity during its occupation of the Philippines. And this is what today is known as spatial analysis, crime mapping, or hotspot policing. Vollmer once told an audience of American police officers, quote, "I've studied military tactics and used them to good effect in rounding up crooks. After all, we're conducting a war against the enemies of society." And what we see here is that these circuits between colonial methods abroad and internal colonies here mark the racist links between the logic of, quote, civilizing Filipinos and civilizing Black Americans. The sociologist Julian Go calls this imperial feedback. He also traces how Vollmer's police academy taught eugenic thinking, the idea, for instance, that race degeneration led to criminality. So there's this connecting logic of a racial threat to the white supremacist order to be dealt with imperial military tactics. So in sum, police militarization here has always been tied directly to wars abroad. And this is a version of what Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism called the boomerang effect of colonization, American imperialism returning to haunt its own people. Unfortunately, these effects always rebound most powerfully on the most marginalized. For instance, in the US as well as in Canada, police have often deployed military-style equipment and tactics to violently suppress Indigenous and First Nations claims to land, water, and environmental justice, most visible most recently in the Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock. Now, the stakes of grasping this argument are high. If there was no pre-militarized time zero, then militarization is just not a switch that can be turned off if we shut down equipment transfer programs. This conceptual division between police and the military is what Nicole Siegel calls a vanishing horizon, or a fundamental cohabitation, where the police and the military have always been intertwined and anti-Black and colonial. And understanding this history helps us understand against whom the fire hoses are turned today. Now, to turn to post 9/11 militarization. After 9/11, the US government poured money into policing in the name of counterterrorism and homeland security, offering this whole new set of justifications for militarization. The federal government opened this free-flowing spigot of military equipment and expertise in the name of counterterrorism. Intelligence sharing hubs called fusion centers popped up all over the country. The Department of Homeland Security was established and began funneling funding and offering trainings to police on bioterrorism and IEDs, improvised explosive devices. ICE was formed and started coordinating with police to identify suspected deportable immigrants. Local law enforcement started or escalated training in other countries, particularly in Israel, and the immigration enforcement infrastructure in general exploded. Now, what I found in my own field work with police is that officers tend to often depoliticize these changes as simply a matter of public security or officer safety. They often consider it purely defensive and what they need to serve in their roles as the front lines of homeland defense. From a different angle, these changes have drawn local policing into much tighter collaboration with the military and federal agencies like ICE. They have outfitted cops with otherwise inaccessible aircraft and armored trucks, and have trained them to think of county dams and pumpkin festivals as potential targets for terrorism. Many police departments have also absorbed the counterterror mandate, which frames racialized populations, especially Muslims, as internal enemies. So I'll try to give you a sense here of what this militarization has meant in terms of three issues among many that could be discussed: the flows of military equipment to police, the expanding surveillance and intelligence infrastructure, and police departments hiring military veterans. Now, to start with equipment, what people tend to be most familiar with is the 1033 program, which functionally recycles excess military equipment by distributing unneeded property to police departments for free. This includes very banal things like office supplies, which make up the bulk of the items transferred in terms of quantity. In terms of value, the most expensive items transferred are what are called controlled items, such as robots, weapons, and mine-resistant vehicles. To gain access through this equipment through the program, police departments must describe their need for this equipment in terms of counter-terror or counter-drug operations. But they're also not allowed to stockpile this equipment. They have to use it within 1 year, which creates an incentive to use it for other reasons than what was initially described. I found in my report that police arsenals today include over $25 million worth of equipment transferred by the 1033 program before 9/11 versus over $1.5 billion of equipment transferred since 9/11. And I'm happy to talk about those numbers if anyone has questions. These transfers also include a minimum of 1,100 mine-resistant vehicles built for the streets of Iraq. It also includes unmanned vehicles, unarmed, often used for bomb disposal. Over 1,000 of those items total, $77 million worth. Now, these numbers can only be proxies for what we've seen as a massive upsurge. These figures don't even encompass how much was actually transferred for various reasons. For instance, non-controlled equipment such as office supplies falls off the books after 1 year. So we've noted that over $5.7 billion worth of equipment transferred since the program was instituted in 1990 are just untrackable. Now, the 1033 program has come under the most scrutiny by far, but there are also many other ways to obtain this equipment, which are often much less transparent. Departments can buy this equipment new, for instance, through a major Homeland Security grants program through the Department of Homeland Security. which channels over $1 billion per year to police departments for counterterror purposes. Departments can also put requests for this equipment in their city budgets, or they can use the profits from civil asset forfeiture to buy this equipment. Now, this is where departments can profit from seized property or cash of people who are merely suspected of a crime. And civil asset forfeiture allows seizures without search warrants or indictments, and the burden is on the owner to prove very expensively that their property was legally acquired. And to note, this tool is so ripe for abuse that 2 of its architects called it in 2014 unreformable and called for its abolition. The second component I'll touch on here is the surveillance and intelligence infrastructure. And as intelligence sharing between US agencies became this major domestic priority in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, local police took up this novel role in the counterterror intelligence infrastructure as the on-the-ground experts equipped to spot nascent terror threats. And the rise of intelligence units in police departments was epitomized by the New York Police Department's Muslim surveillance program. Over more than a decade, this infamous program secretly spied on, mapped, criminalized, and undermined the freedom and safety of Muslim communities in the name of counterterrorism. Police departments have also been able to obtain surveillance technology built for the military. For instance, a secret spy plane surveilling Baltimore, focused on majority Black West Baltimore, which worked with the Baltimore Police Department secretly in 2016. This plane uses wide-angle cameras mounted on a plane to take photos of the city every second, and partnered with BPD to track crime, particularly homicides. And the founder of this company developed this technology for surveillance in Iraq for US Marines. To take another example, during the recent George Floyd protests, local police departments alongside federal agencies used military-developed tools like Predator drones to track and target activists. Now, it's important to note that this kind of surveillance of protesters and racialized groups is certainly not new. See the FBI's surveillance and harassment of the Black Panthers, Martin Luther King Jr., et cetera. But post-9/11 technology and coordination has dramatically increased the tools available for this project. It also represents immense potential for future surveillance, for instance, facial recognition. The third factor I'll touch on is veterans being hired into police departments. Data are really sparse on this, but analyses do suggest that about 25% of police officers have current or prior military service compared to about 7% of the general population. And this is partly due to direct federal efforts. For instance, there was a $100 million Department of Justice grant given in 2012 to hire specifically post-9/11 veterans into law enforcement. One issue with this is that state-level veterans preference laws give hiring advantages to veterans, which can obstruct efforts by police departments to hire people of color and or women because veterans are disproportionately white and male. And the recent legacy of veterans in policing is quite complex. Some data suggest that veterans are less likely to needlessly shoot civilians in fear because they are apparently better trained and more disciplined, though one must immediately recall the multitude of unpunished atrocities throughout US military history, including quite recently. Some police and police reformers push to further professionalize, bureaucratize, and discipline police along military lines. On the other hand, some studies suggest that veterans may be more likely to have fired their service weapons at least once in their careers as police officers and may receive more complaints from civilians. Police administrators themselves have expressed concerns with veterans' mental health struggles and with the need to retrain them in the use of force. One can also note that Derek Chauvin, the main officer who killed George Floyd, served for 8 years as military police in the Army Reserve. So military equipment, surveillance and intelligence, and veterans are 3 ways that wars have helped militarize US police since 9/11. And I'll close here by touching on some of the costs. Most obvious, of course, is economic. At minimum, tens of billions of dollars since 9/11 have flowed to private companies who supply military equipment or military style equipment to police. The outcomes for this expenditure are highly murky, even by these agencies' own standards. The Department of Homeland Security's own Office of Inspector General noted in 2012 that the major Homeland Security grants program I mentioned earlier had no system to assess funding effectiveness, did not know the amount of funding required to achieve their needed preparedness capabilities, and did not require states to report their progress. The 1033 program is often hailed as saving taxpayer money, but this is also a complex question. Police departments and therefore taxpayers must always pay upkeep, storage, etc., for equipment that may never be used for its stated purposes. All levels of government also spend uncountable sums every year on counterterror training and surveillance technologies. Like with the military, the carceral system, immigration, etc., not only are these systems fundamentally racist and immoral, there are also opportunity costs. Every investment in drones, armored vehicles, and surveillance systems is a dollar denied to education, infrastructure, and renewable energy. Another cost is that the erosion of public legitimacy, this is a concern for police reformers, that the erosion of public legitimacy obstructs crime solving and makes people less likely to cooperate with the goals of community policing. A deeper cost is in terms of police violence and racialized control. One study found that 1033 program transfers correlate with increased civilian killings. The program's expansion has ridden the coattails of the war on terror, but it is much more often used in routine counter-drug work and protest policing. For instance, we see intimidating escalatory equipment and tactics rolled out against Black and Indigenous-led movements, whereas it was nowhere to be found at the majority white Women's March. Throughout the long history of Black and Indigenous liberation, justice, and sovereignty movements, it's very clear against whom tear gas and heavy weapons are used, who is seen as a threat to the state, to white supremacy, to capitalism. Much controlled equipment and tactics are also the purview of SWAT. SWAT was popularized during the drug war, but continues to be used disproportionately against people of color. An ACLU study found that 79% of the deployments in their study were for search warrants, usually for drugs. 42% of those impacted were Black and 12% were Latinx. Approximately 9,000 agencies today have SWAT teams, which deploy in total an estimated 60,000 times per year, which comes down to almost 165 times per day minimum. This hasn't lowered crime rates or demonstrably improved officer safety, but instead led to disastrous botched raids. For instance, 7-year-old Ayanna Stanley Jones shot and killed in Detroit. Baby Boo Boo, a 19-month-old, severely burned by a Georgia sheriff's office who threw a flashbang grenade into his playpen. And most recently, 26-year-old Breonna Taylor, an EMT who was shot 8 times and killed in a raid, not even by SWAT, but by plainclothes police. SWAT apparently didn't even see her as a significant enough threat to send in what is considered the more professionalized unit. So situating this violence within the history of US police helps us understand the anti-Blackness and coloniality inherent in these forms of state violence. I'll just make 2 more points and then I'll close. At an even deeper level, there's a problem that we see here of critical analysis. The seeming extremity of armored personnel carriers on American streets galvanizes public outrage, but also makes it seem like ratcheting back racialized police violence is primarily a question of limiting military equipment. And to return to Napper and Kaba, the problem, quote, "The problem with casting militarization as the problem is that the formulation suggests it is the excess against which we must rally. We must accept that the ordinary is fair for an extreme to be the problem." In truth, the history of US police militarization reveals that such violence runs a lot deeper than equipment transfers. Militarization is inseparable from racism and white supremacy, and in the post-9/11 world of increased resources, racial control has been further normalized. Finally, the sheer spectacle of militarization can even further narrow the terms of analysis by implicitly legitimizing US military interventions. One gesture we often see even progressive commentators making during militarized policing of US protests is to mark their visual similarity to a generic quote unquote third world country, as we saw in Ferguson. They argue that this should not happen at home, implying that state repression and US military violence elsewhere are simply to be expected. These analyses serve to naturalize the destruction of non-American targets of the US military, reinforcing American centrism and obscuring the connections between racist state violence in the US and abroad. So I will close there, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that quite comprehensive historically and contemporary perspective on militarization of policing. I have a number of questions that I'll just start with.
Sure.
If I might. You know, I like how you took it back to the colonial period and forward in the United States history and the US imperial wars. But could we think about it also in terms of some psychological roots, deeper psychological roots? In particular, I'm thinking about fear. What would you say that in times of greater fear, existential threat, we're more likely to accept more militarized policing? Or another question that is related to that, and I don't want to pile on too much in one question here, is do you see a correlation between periods when the United States is spending a lot on the military, either for a Cold War or a hot war, and when and the spending and the focus on policing? Do they map each other, or do they basically stay steady? Does the militarization of policing go down when the United States is in a sort of more internationally quiescent moment, such as right after the Cold War?
That's a great question. I'll start with the second one on spending. And one of the problems here is that we really lack good data. People, I think, partly tend to focus on the 1033 program because it is the direct transfer of military equipment, but people also focus on it because it's really the only, they publish fairly comprehensive data publicly since I think 2016 on sort of agency level transfers. So those data represent immense possibilities for sort of going back in history and tracing these transfers, but we don't, even within the 1033 program, there are difficulties tracing it too far back because equipment tends to fall off the books, as I mentioned. We can't track equipment that's been disposed of or returned to the Department of Defense, which runs the 1033 program. But all of these are relatively minor problems compared to the lack of quantitative empirical data available on any other equipment transfer program, on grants programs, much less on the sort of slightly more nebulous questions of where other spending is going. Those are really difficult to track. So what I do have a sense of from the data that we have available is that 1033 program transfers seem to represent sort of a lagging indicator for the sort of process of US military withdrawal, particularly from Iraq in 2010. We anyway start seeing a spike in more expensive equipment as mine-resistant vehicles started being withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan. But we especially see a spike in those transfers to police after the drawdown in 2010. So there's clearly some tracking happening in terms of equipment transfers. There's clearly tracking happening between federal military spending and police trainings, but it's very tough to track empirically. And as to your second question on fear, it's a really great question. One thing that I think is very interesting is how we tend to respond to mass shootings, which of course many people have advocated to be talked of and thought about in terms of domestic terrorism. It's taken the FBI a long time to catch on, and also white supremacist mass violence or attempted mass violence. But what we did see, for instance, in San Bernardino, is that the news coverage of police use of military style equipment and tactics to catch the fleeing shooters was sort of lauded by media outlets that had otherwise given critical coverage of police militarization after Ferguson. And I think this was in 2016, the San Bernardino shooting, I think. So I think we do see a certain kind of acceptance when there's mass public fear of these sort of more militarized style tactics.
Okay. There's a question from the audience, which I'll phrase for everyone. Has President Trump used military policing domestically?
So yes, but it's a difficult question because, of course, the president has some limited control. But what we did see is that, for instance, with the 1033 program, President Obama had instituted limits on the program after Ferguson in 2014. He had instituted a committee review I'm forgetting what the name of the body is, but basically a committee review of the program, and then implemented restrictions to keep police from getting, for instance, tracked armored vehicles that look like tanks, bayonets, grenade launchers, which are usually used for launching tear gas. And President Trump, I think quite quickly after he came into office, rolled back those restrictions, which did allow for what we might consider more militarized policing. One issue there is that even President Obama's restrictions were largely symbolic and were sort of intended to be so. But we did also, I mean, one, of course, very prominent incident that this person might have had in mind is Trump's apparently ordering, I think it was DC police, to clear out protesters violently with tear gas. He's also, of course, for his Bible holding up photo opportunity, he's also, of course, tried to pressure police in Portland and elsewhere to intervene on protests with highly militarized policing. And we're already seeing police in Portland using so much tear gas of their own accord that there are concerns that they've poisoned the water because of all of the runoff from their use of tear gas over the last, I think, 100 days or so. So short answer is yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. I also wanted to ask about how you would compare the United States level of militarized policing to other countries if you had a chance to look at that, comparable democracies.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, the context in which I'm, with which I'm most familiar is obviously the US, but one thing that is certainly unique about the US compared to comparable democracies or really most of the rest of the world is our level of gun ownership, which is often used as a justification for certain kinds of militarized policing. For instance, SWAT teams are one rationale for using SWAT teams when police departments are assessing whether to use SWAT, whether to use plainclothes police, uniformed police, whatever, another unit, is whether the person or people in the house possess guns. And in the US, I think the statistic is that 4 in 10 people live in a home with a gun, with a firearm. And also the fact that US police are so heavily armed relative to, say, the UK or France or India or many other places also makes this sort of unique context in the levels of what we might call militarization, the levels of what kinds of equipment are used. There's a certain incomparability there that makes the US sort of unique, unfortunately.
Thank you. There is an audience question about comparing Republicans and Democratic administrations. In other words, do they take different approaches toward police militarization since the Cold War, or has there been a seamless continuum?
Great question. I mean, I'm an anthropologist, not a historian, so I can't speak in too much detail to this. But my general understanding is that on issues of foreign policy and national security, there's been overall broadly in terms of the logic, a fairly seamless continuum in terms of Republican and Democratic administrations, and specifically towards police militarization. Again, the Obama administration was hailed in some quarters as trying to directly address police militarization when it became a topic of national debate after Ferguson. But again, most of the changes that the administration was able to make were quite symbolic, not addressing any of the roots of the problems, some of which I've touched on today. So yeah, fairly seamless in some ways.
Okay, and I just wanted to ask a little bit, sort of go a little bit deeper on the ideology part, because what you focused on in your talk appropriately was equipment, surveillance, the hiring of veterans. But in the first part of your talk, you mentioned ideology. And I wanted you to maybe spend a few minutes and talk about what you mean by ideology. And I think what you meant was the racialized and imperial context, but did you also mean ideologies about the use of force and attitudes about whether force works? Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Definitely, yeah. So this is something that I'm very interested in my own research. For instance, in officer safety trainings, what kind of ideology is imported to, is inculcated in police, I think is really interesting and definitely plays in here. I think what we see is in the ways that police are trained, especially over the last 10 years or so, has been to sort of naturalize the use of force as just a technical problem, a professional problem. You need to learn how to do it properly. You need to learn what the legal limits are, but it's not necessarily talked about as a sort of moral issue. It's just considered like, this is part of the job. You will be expected to have to use certain kinds of force, and even the language of use of force, like a lot of other language used in policing, is itself a depoliticizing language. One is not talking about violence, one is not talking about brutality. And in fact, if you use those terms with police, there will sometimes be pushback. Like for them, this is not violence. For them, this is just the sort of technical use of force against people who require you to use force. So, there's this idea, and they're trained to think of crowds as inherently threatening. A crowd, even of peaceful protesters, can, according to them, become out of control at any moment. And it's sort of, the ideology is basically this natural flow from like somebody, a crowd becomes out of control, somebody reaches into their pocket that is inherently a threat, and then the use of force, you're almost like a, how do I put it, like you're almost a tool who doesn't have a choice as an officer. You're required to do it as part of your job, and it's just what is natural.
Thank you. I wanted to then flip the script a little bit and talk a little bit about if you know anything about it, the civilianization of the military in the sense of, this is a Harold Lasswell term. Lasswell talked about the Garrison state and the militarization of civilian institutions and government. But he also talked about the civilianization of the military. And I'm in particular thinking about the use of National Guards. For instance, in the 1960s and early 1970s, in the anti-Vietnam War protests, the use of the National Guard against labor unrest in the early 20th century, and then the National Guard being deployed more recently in Washington, D.C. Can you say something about the the civilianization of the military, the sort of, blurring of the lines there?
I mean, that's certainly a realm in which I think you're more familiar with than I am. I know a little bit about crossovers, overlaps, for instance, between the National Guard and police. And I can speak a little bit maybe to the civilianization of policing, which I imagine is at least a parallel trend. I know that what we see, a sort of trend that even police themselves tend to advocate for, is for civilianizing police departments in the sense of using more civilians to fulfill police functions besides the use of force, besides violence, to sort of free them up for doing the kind of work that they see as real policing. So, you know, bringing in civilians for drug overdose interventions, for mental health crisis interventions. Some of this is also meant to facilitate less violence in and of itself, but some of it is also meant to free police up from what they see, from what many of them see as being social workers, quote unquote, as taking on jobs that they don't think are theirs. So I'm not sure if that's a trend or a set of ideas that maps onto the military. I haven't read the Garrison State, but that's the bit that I know about civilianization.
Yeah, so the Garrison State hypothesis that Lasswell proposed in 1941, and then he talked about it throughout the 1950s and early 60s, was the idea that constant mobilization and militarization would lead to the dominance of the specialists on violence in the government and the sort of acquiescence of the public sphere, but that the military would need, and he talks about policing as well, the military and police would need the skills of civilians in order to do their job better. So that might be of interest to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then I wanted to just read you a quote from James Madison, one of the founding fathers. He says, "Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other, enemy of liberty, true liberty. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." How do you react to Madison? Do you think that it's really warfare, or is it something else that you've described this long historical trajectory, and is it sort of just running parallel and not as much linked? How do you respond to that?
I think that's a lovely quote, and I think we've heard plenty of other people make that same argument. I think in the context of these trends that I'm trying to trace, I think the fact that the war on terror has provided all of these new justifications for various kinds of state violence, interlinked state violence, fits in very nicely with that quote. Whether or not the U.S. is officially at war, whether it's something that Madison would recognize as warfare, I think is a different question. But sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Yeah, basically, I think we do see warfare undermining freedom in the sense that it constantly provides this recourse. Police, I've seen in my own field work that police, the county dam example came from my field work. Well, the Pumpkin Festival fieldwork example came from John Oliver back in 2014. But, my own fieldwork, police defended the need to think of their county dam or their, whatever tiny little bit of infrastructure as a target of terrorism, and therefore needing all of this extra security and equipment to protect, precisely because of the war on terror and the idea that, any piece of infrastructure could be a target. And so, this is just one small way I think that we see endless warfare underwriting this preparedness orientation, this sense that a certain kind of uncertainty underwrites almost any form of preparedness or violence, which we again then see often being used not for its stated purposes, which would be problematic on its own, but for precisely the same targets of US policing since its founding.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of goes back to my first question, which is about fear and that sort of underlying anxiety, which would promote support for a militarized response to perceived threats, whether those threats are cultural or ideological or political or actually physical to property or to other humans.
Yeah, well, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's part of what, particularly at the sort of local or the more ethnographic level, can make this actually such a complex question, because it's not, I think we would be doing a disservice to our own analyses if we looked at some of these, if we looked at fear, for instance, fear of, a certain conception of terrorism and saw it as only purely an instrument of expanding control. Expanding racialized control. It is that, but it is also something else. It is also that police are genuinely trained to fear certain kinds of threats. And that's what, that's part of what makes this such a complex and difficult edifice to address. And again, something that, it's not like, and this is something I try and address in my own research, it's not like sort of minimal reforms, tinkering around the edges, trying to minimize fear one way or another, are really going to get at the root of these problems, which are, as you say, partly psychological, which are partly training, which are, of course, deeply political and racialized. It makes it a really tough question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what was very interesting to me was the link you made with the early 20th century and the Philippines wars. And I've looked at the way that the Philippines war went in the Philippines, and there were really two different strands. One strand was brute force and, rounding up civilians, putting them in compounds, which they called protected zones, and then shooting anyone that moved outside the zones. On the other hand, there was a lot of reform, and this they called benevolent assimilation, right? So that this was linked to policing and the reforms and the use. In other words, the two went side by side. The use of brute force and these benevolent assimilation things like bringing in sanitation, teaching, and different forms of local policing, so that you're eventually sort of passing on some of the duties of pacification to the local police. So and then what you're saying is that came back to the US. I think that's fascinating. With Volmar, is it? And John Oliver. Right. Do you want to say more about that period?
Sure. I mean, I would definitely, I imagine you may have, but for anyone who's interested, Alfred McCoy, God, I'm forgetting the name of the book, but On the Philippine-American War, sort of traces these links between what sorts of policing and control the US military brought into the Philippines, developed there along with Filipino state forces, and how that has boomeranged back to the US. And I think that also speaks to, these, I don't really get into this much in the report, but, the whole other paper could be written on, the politicization of the military. And this is where we see these endless sort of cross-pollinations that these counterinsurgency tactics, developed in the Philippines, were then, brought back to the US and, developed into various police reforms here, which can be thought of as counterinsurgency, as pacification, and then were brought to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think what that really points to is that, again, this conceptual division between the police and the military is in a lot of ways fictitious. And as Nicole Siegel talks about in her book, Violence Work, it takes a lot of labor to maintain these fictitious divisions when, throughout specifically the Philippine-American War and the US occupation of the Philippines, and more recent wars, and of course, again, the history of US policing, we see this endless intertwining and learning from each other in terms of counterinsurgency tactics.
Thank you. I'll take another question and read that. There seems to be a parallel between various non-police roles taken on by police forces, for example, mental health, and the non-combat roles taken on by US troops in conflict zones. In the latter case, the worry is that the military becomes all-encompassing and hollows out Department of State or USAID. Can we say the same about the police, or is the police already all-encompassing? And that's why we hear calls to defund the police.
This is such a great question. Yes, though again, it's complicated. I think the direction of causality is complicated. What we have seen in the US, particularly since the Reagan administration in the 80s, is the hollowing out, of course, of the welfare state, of mental health support, of other forms of social safety, of our social safety net, which have, throughout various both Democratic and Republican administrations been completely eviscerated. And what I think what we see historically is not that, those systems have become eviscerated because police have taken on quote unquote non-police roles, but rather that police have come to fill those gaps. And I'll note that that's something that, even some officers in my own fieldwork recognized for themselves. They would point to the fact that, the mental health hospital down the road shut down 10 years ago. And since then, we've gotten a huge increase in calls for, for mental health crises. So there's a very clear connection there between what kinds of services are not being provided by the state anymore, or are being provided extremely shoddily, and leaving people homeless, leaving people sick, leaving people without the treatment or the support that they need for various struggles. And the police then end up filling this role. So I think the process there is different to my understanding than the military, but it is a very similar trend where the state arm of violence, in this case, the domestic state arm, ends up coming to fill the gaps created by the withdrawal of the welfare state. So great question. Sorry, one last thing. Yeah, I missed the part about defunding the police. I do think that this is the calls to defund the police are often trying to address this issue by arguing that some money, and this is particularly when one is talking about the sort of less radical or less radical calls to, and I mean that in a positive way, to defund the police, where one is talking about defunding the police as sort of a light reform. People often talk about that in terms of withdrawing the money that goes to mental health crisis support within police departments, and instead putting that money into specialized units composed of civilians. And this gets back to the question of civilianizing the police. This very much tracks with this trend. So yeah, that is partly why we hear calls to defund the police. From a more radical perspective, of course, from an abolitionist standpoint, calls to defund the police might start with that, start with withdrawing some funding for police to fulfill non-police roles, but then ultimately moving toward defunding the police altogether, with the goal of eventually abolishing the police. So I think there are sort of different points along maybe a spectrum, but I do think that they sort of start with this idea of withdrawing the police from these, extra police roles that they've taken on over the last few decades.
That's great. So you mentioned interviews that you've done with police, and I wanted to know if you could say more about their sense of the impact of militarization.
It's varied, and I'll try and keep it quick because I know we only have a couple minutes, but it's a heterogeneous field. Some people, some officers they contested even the term militarization. They argued that, US policing correctly in some ways has always been paramilitary. And again, sort of depoliticized equipment and tactics and so on as just the necessary tools that they needed for their jobs. Other people were very concerned with the impact on their public image, partly for the sake of PR, but also partly out of genuine concern about wanting civilians to trust them, and would see things like mine-resistant vehicles as ridiculous, as obstructing undermining their legitimacy, and so on. But I didn't encounter any who made the sort of more overarching critiques or analyses that I'm making in this paper, and that lots of other scholars and activists have also made that I'm drawing on. So
well, thank you very much for this really interesting and enlightening talk. And I'll just urge people to read the paper if they haven't. It's on the Cost of War website or on the BU Pardee Center website. You can find the link to it. Next time we meet in this format, it will be Wednesday, November 18th, 11 a.m. to 12. Heidi Peltier will speak about the camo economy, the economic and political camouflage of military contracting. Until then, let's hope that we don't see police on the streets after the election.
Dark times. Thank you so much, Nita. Thank you for this.
Anytime.